Discover your ego, your sweet enemy. Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about something that's been lurking inside all of us for as long as we can remember, the ego. If you're anything like me, you probably thought the ego was just a word people tossed around in spiritual blogs or self-help books. Some abstract concept that didn't really apply to your life. But I was wrong. The ego is everywhere, and it's probably the reason you're not as at peace as you could be. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Drop your city and current time in the comments. I'd love to see where you're tuning in from today. Now, let's get comfortable and let's get started today. I always thought I knew who I was. Don't we all? I could tell you what I liked, what I stood for, what I didn't like, which is just as important. I could tell you about my job, my friends, the hobbies I had carefully curated over the years. I was me, and I had it all figured out. Or at least I thought I did. Then, one day it hit me, what I thought was me wasn't really me at all. It was a mask, a character, a well-constructed version of myself I'd been building over the years to satisfy something deeper, something more complicated, something I couldn't quite place. I wasn't aware of it at first. It's like being in a dream where everything seems normal, but something's off until you wake up and suddenly everything's clearer. But here's the thing. I wasn't waking up from a dream. I was waking up to the fact that the person I thought I was wasn't me. It was my ego. And let me tell you, that realization was terrifying. Because the ego, it doesn't want to be found. It hides, shapes, and manipulates everything it can to stay in control. It's the sneaky voice in your head telling you who to be, what to like, and how to act. And until you see it for what it really is, you're just along for the ride. I think I've been operating on autopilot, letting my ego dictate everything without even realizing it. I wasn't aware of the game I was playing. I just assumed this was who I was meant to be. It felt like I was living my best life. But there was a subtle unease, a feeling like I was chasing something that was always just out of reach. The funny thing is, the ego doesn't even need to be obvious. It can be slick, charming, and even helpful. It can show up in all the good things, ambition, self-discipline, and even the way we seek love or validation from others. In my case, it was wrapped up in my need to be seen as successful, both by my peers and by myself. I thought success would make me feel more like myself, more grounded, more complete. But instead, it only made me feel like I was further away from the real me. It wasn't until I took a step back and really started looking at my motivations that I began to understand. The drive to succeed, the constant need for approval, the fear of being judged. It was all driven by the ego. And it wasn't enough for the ego to be good. It had to be the best. The ego wants to be in control of everything. Your image, your emotions, your relationships. It's so deeply embedded in the fabric of your life that you can't see where it ends and where you begin. But there's a problem with that. The more I let my ego control my actions, the more distant I became from who I really was. The version of me that existed without the filter, without the desire to impress. The worst part? I didn't even realize it was happening. It wasn't until I took a hard look in the mirror and saw the real me, or rather, the person I had become, that I understood how far I'd drifted from my true self. What most people won't admit is this. The ego isn't inherently bad. It's a survival mechanism. It helps you navigate the world. But when it starts running the show, when it decides who you are, what you want, and how you interact with the world, that's when the trouble begins. You stop living for you, and you start living for the ego's version of success and perfection. It's funny, really. The ego wants so badly to protect you, to keep you safe, but it ends up suffocating you instead. You find yourself trapped in a cycle of chasing, always wanting more, always striving for something just beyond your grasp. The more you achieve, the more the ego demands. And suddenly, the things you thought you wanted aren't even fulfilling anymore. And so, there I was, living what seemed like a dream life, checking all the boxes, meeting all the goals, but still feeling empty, like something was missing. And the more I achieved, the more I felt like I was just scratching the surface, never really touching what mattered. But then something shifted. I started to question everything, not in a deep, philosophical sense at first, Just little questions. Why was I always chasing approval? Why was I so scared of being judged? What would happen if I stopped trying to impress people and just lived for me? It wasn't easy. In fact, it was uncomfortable. The ego doesn't give up easily. It fights back. But slowly, over time, I started to see the cracks. And the more I pulled at those cracks, the more I realized the person I thought I was, the one who craved validation, success, and perfection, wasn't me at all. It was my ego. And that's when I realized my ego had been my sweetest enemy all along. The problem with not seeing the game is that you don't realize you're playing it. I spent years chasing after things, assuming I was doing everything right, all the while unaware that the prize I was chasing wasn't even real. The ego is clever like that. It doesn't just give you false goals. It makes you believe they're your own. The trick isn't to convince you that what you want is wrong. No, the trick is to make you think this is the way it's supposed to be. That the endless pursuit of approval and success is who you are. I'm sure you've had those moments. The ones where you're doing something, whether it's in your career or personal life, and it feels like you're on autopilot. You don't even realize it until you stop and ask, wait, why am I doing this again? It's like you've been driving down a road so long that you forgot why you started the journey in the first place. I remember that first moment of awareness like it was yesterday. I was sitting in a meeting, running through a pitch for a project I thought would validate me. I had practiced every word, planned every gesture, and made sure everything was perfect. My ego was running the show, and I was doing everything in my power to look good in front of everyone. But something felt off. I took a breath in the middle of speaking and realized I didn't actually care about this project. I didn't care about impressing anyone. I didn't care about the accolades. What I cared about was the story I had built around my success, the narrative that said, if I keep winning, I'll finally feel like I've made it. But the truth was, the more I chased that narrative, the more I felt like I was losing myself. And that's when I realized it. The ego had tricked me into believing I needed all these external validations to feel good enough. What the ego doesn't tell you is that no matter how much you achieve, there's always a new bar to reach. When you succeed, the ego doesn't celebrate. It just asks, what's next? That moment of satisfaction is fleeting. The ego doesn't want you to be content. It doesn't want you to be still. It wants you to constantly feel the pull of something more. If you're not moving forward, it says you're falling behind. And this is where things get complicated. The more you listen to the ego, the more it feeds you this never-ending cycle of dissatisfaction. You achieve one thing, and the ego demands another. But the new thing never quite satisfies. It leaves you with that familiar feeling, emptiness, like something is missing. But it's not the thing that's missing. It's the part of you that you've been ignoring while you chase the external validation. You might think you're in control, but when the ego takes over, it leads you down paths that don't even align with who you truly are. The more you let it take the wheel, the further you drift from the real you. And you start believing that what the ego wants is actually what you want. One of the most unsettling realizations I had during this process was how subtly the ego infiltrates every part of your identity. It doesn't just shape the career choices you make. It shapes how you think about yourself, how you relate to others, and how you define your worth. I began to notice that everything I thought I was doing for myself was really just about impressing someone else, whether it was my family, my friends, or the society I was living in. And that, my friends, is the sneakiest trick the ego pulls. It convinces you that your desires are your own when they're really a reflection of everything around you. The ego makes you believe that your value is attached to external markers, money, status, approval, but it never lets you get close enough to feel the internal peace you're seeking. It's like running a race where you can never see the finish line, but you keep pushing forward, hoping that one more step will get you closer. But the truth is, you're not even running towards the right destination. The more you chase, the more you feel lost. I started to see how often my ego sabotaged me. When I looked deeper, I realized the cycle had been happening for years. Every time I achieved something, the ego whispered, "That's great, but what else?" And in that whisper, I ignored the voice of my true self, the one that wanted to be content, the one that wanted peace without needing to perform or prove anything. That's when I started questioning everything. Not just my actions, but my intentions. Why was I doing what I was doing? Was it because I truly wanted it? Or because my ego had convinced me it was necessary? Was I building a career for the love of the work or for the applause? Was I saying yes to things because they felt right or because they looked good on paper? These questions were uncomfortable but necessary. The more I sat with them, the more I started peeling back the layers of the persona I had built. I realized how much I had been letting my ego define who I was, even when I thought I was doing everything for the right reasons. The more I uncovered, the more I understood just how deep the ego's roots had grown in my life. And it was liberating in a strange way, because for the first time, I felt like I was waking up to something real, something beyond the ego's noise. I was starting to hear the quiet voice of my true self, buried beneath the constant clamor of expectations and the need to impress. The question wasn't, what do I need to do to succeed, but what do I truly want? It's a scary question, isn't it? Because asking it means you might have to give up the identity you've been building for years. It means letting go of the stories the ego has been telling you about who you are and what you need to be. And that's terrifying because without those stories, who are you? But slowly, I began to realize I don't need the ego's story to be me. I don't need to be defined by external achievements, by other people's opinions, or by the goals set by a part of me that's more concerned with appearances than authenticity. When you start to see the game your ego is playing, you stop participating in it. You stop chasing after the next thing and begin to find satisfaction in what is. You start to ask yourself, what does it look like to be truly me without the constant noise of the ego? That, my friends, is where the real work begins. When you look in a mirror, what do you see? We all think we know, right? Our reflections seem so familiar, so clear. But have you ever stopped to ask, are you looking at yourself, or are you looking at the image your ego has created for you? I spent years staring at myself in the mirror, and I thought I was seeing the real me. But what I didn't know was that the version of myself I was seeing had been carefully constructed by my ego. It was the version that was presentable, acceptable, and polished enough to meet society's standards. But it wasn't me. It was the mask I wore. The crazy part was, I had no idea it wasn't me until I really stopped and looked. Because the ego doesn't just create a version of you for the world to see. It convinces you you are that version. The ego shows up in the way you dress, the way you talk, the way you behave. It builds a story around you that seems true, but it's not. And that's where the trouble starts. For years, I thought I had it figured out. I thought that if I just kept refining the story, kept becoming the person my ego told me to be, ambitious, successful, confident, everything would fall into place. But the more I played that game, the more disconnected I felt from the core of who I really was. Every time I achieved something, it felt like I was stepping further and further away from the person I wanted to be. It's like looking at a photograph of yourself and thinking, yeah, that's me, even though it's only a snapshot of one moment. The photo's not a lie, but it's not the whole story either. What about the moments in between? What about the real you that doesn't get captured in a single image? One of the most difficult realizations for me was that my reflection in the mirror wasn't just my image. It was a projection of my ego's desires. My ego didn't want me to be whole. It wanted me to be acceptable. It told me to dress a certain way, act a certain way, and speak a certain way. The things that were truly mine, the things that made me feel alive, excited, or even nervous, were often buried beneath the layers of what I should do or should be. But the ego's mirror doesn't show you who you truly are. It only shows you who you think you need to be. That was my reality. I was looking at an image that reflected everything my ego wanted from me, but nothing of who I really was. It wasn't until I started questioning my reflection that things began to shift. I didn't do it in a dramatic, I'm going to burn everything down way. No, it was more subtle. I just asked myself a simple question. Is this really me, or is this what my ego has made me into? I began to see the cracks in the image, the places where the mask was falling apart. I noticed how often I changed my demeanor to fit in. How many times I bit my tongue or pretended to be someone I wasn't, just to be accepted. The ego loves validation, and when it's not getting that, It starts molding you into whatever shape it thinks will get the praise. It's the chameleon effect. You become what others want you to be, all the while telling yourself it's who you really are. When I started seeing through the mirror my ego had created for me, I realized something important. The more I tried to shape myself to meet external expectations, the less I felt like myself. The more I lived by the ego's rules, the more disconnected I became from the true source of my happiness and peace. This wasn't just a matter of changing clothes or a haircut. It was deeper than that. It was about finding out who I was beneath the mask I had worn for so long. The problem is, when you live for the ego's version of yourself, you forget what's beneath it. You stop listening to the parts of you that truly matter. The quiet desires, the passions, the things that make you feel alive when no one's watching. And once I started dismantling that mirror, I saw a different reflection. Not perfect, not polished, but authentic. And that, my friends, is when the real journey began. I still look in the mirror, of course. But now, instead of seeing the person I should be, I try to see the person I am. Not the person my ego wants me to be, but the person who exists underneath all the noise. It's not easy. The ego doesn't like to go down without a fight. But the more I pull away from the image it's been forcing me to maintain, the more I get closer to what's real. Here's where the academic debate enters. Is it possible to truly separate yourself from your ego? Or do we need the ego to function in the world? Some would argue that without the ego, we lose our sense of self entirely. But what if that sense of self is just a distraction from our true nature? What if the ego, in its search for validation and control, is actually keeping us from the deeper connection we're seeking? These are questions I began asking myself as I started peeling back the layers of who I thought I was. And the more I questioned, the more I began to understand that the reflection I was seeing in the mirror wasn't just shaped by me. It was shaped by everyone else's expectations of me, too. So I'm still looking, still questioning, still unpacking the layers. But now I see the ego for what it is, a beautiful, tricky, and often unnecessary companion in my journey. It doesn't define me. It doesn't have to run the show. And with every little piece I peel away, I'm getting closer to the truth of who I've always been underneath it all. The ego thrives on separation. It convinces us that we're different from others, that we're somehow set apart, either better or worse, but never truly equal. This subtle separation is one of the most powerful tricks the ego plays on us. It tells us we need to differentiate ourselves, to stand out, to be better than others. It whispers, "You're unique, you're special, you deserve more." But in doing so, it isolates you from the very thing you crave, connection. I'll be honest with you, I bought into it. I believed that in order to be truly myself, I had to set myself apart. I had to find what made me different and lean into it. I needed to be the one who could stand out in a crowd. And like most people, I was afraid of being ordinary. I was terrified that if I didn't constantly prove my worth, I'd fade into the background. The ego told me I couldn't just be good enough like everyone else. I had to be the best. I had to be the one people looked up to. And for a while it worked. I played the game, tried to prove I was superior in some way, tried to carve a niche that made me feel special. I surrounded myself with people who shared similar ideals, whose lives seemed like they were more together than mine. I used them as a yardstick to measure my own worth. The ego thrives in this environment. It fuels itself on competition, comparison, and the illusion of being better or more accomplished. But the most important part is that sense of separation was toxic. It created a constant us versus them mentality in my mind. I was always comparing myself to others, trying to one-up them in some way, or try to outdo my past self to prove I was growing. The problem is, when you live in a world of comparisons, you stop seeing people as equals. You stop seeing them as fellow human beings. Instead, they become obstacles to your own success. Competitors in a game you didn't even realize you were playing. The more I fed into the ego's game of separation, the more I felt disconnected from others. Sure, I might have been achieving more, but my relationships felt emptier. I started to feel like everyone around me was either in the competition or outside of it, There was no in between. And you can't build authentic connections when you see others as threats or benchmarks. I'll give you an example. Have you ever noticed how we tend to elevate people we don't know, put them on pedestals, and then tear them down when they fail? It's that same ego-driven impulse at play. We build people up to feel better about ourselves, and then, when they're no longer perfect, we relish in their fall. The ego loves that. It thrives on it. It makes us feel secure in our own superiority. But let's be real, there's no growth in that. There's no real connection. There's only separation, judgment, and the quiet loneliness that comes with trying to be above everyone else. It wasn't until I realized how deep this separation ran that I began to see how damaging it was. The more I tried to distinguish myself from others, the more I pushed myself further away from meaningful relationships and true fulfillment. The ego wants us to believe we're unique and separate, but all it really does is isolate us. It convinces us that we can only be happy if we're better than someone else, that we need to stand out to matter. But that's a lie. You see, the truth is we're not separate. We're all in this together. And the more we realize that, the more we can let go of the ego's grip. We don't have to be better than others. We don't have to outshine them. We just have to be ourselves. And that's enough. In fact, the most freeing realization I had was when I understood that being just me, without trying to be better than everyone else, was the greatest form of connection I could offer the world. The more I allowed myself to be imperfect, to make mistakes, to not always have the answers, the more others connected with me. The more I let go of my ego's need for superiority, the more I embraced my shared humanity with others. Have you ever heard of the term interconnectedness in psychology? It's the idea that we're all deeply connected to each other, and that the more we nurture this connection, the more fulfilling our lives become. The opposite of what the ego wants. The ego wants separation, individuality, competition. But the truth is, the more we let go of that, the more we embrace our shared humanity, the more peace we find. Once I began shifting my mindset from seeing others as competitors to seeing them as fellow travelers in this life, I started experiencing a freedom I'd never known before. I felt more connected to the people around me. I felt like I could be vulnerable, not worried about judgment or comparison. I could show up as I was without worrying if it was enough. And the crazy thing was, it was more than enough. The connections I built weren't based on my achievements or my image. They were based on our shared humanity. The ego will always try to convince you that you need to be better than others, that you need to stand out to matter. But the truth is, when you stop trying to separate yourself, when you stop trying to be above others, that's when you truly start to connect. That's when you discover the peace of not having to compete, not having to prove, and not having to constantly chase approval. So, if you're still caught in the ego's game of separation, ask yourself, what if you didn't need to be different to be valuable? What if, instead of competing, you embraced the beauty of connection? Because at the end of the day, connection is what makes us human. The ego thrives on separation, but true peace comes from realizing we're all in this together. Chasing validation, that was my thing. I didn't realize at the time, but everything I did was tied to a need for external approval. Whether it was through my career, my relationships, or even my hobbies, I was constantly looking for someone to tell me that I was doing the right thing, that I was good enough, that I mattered. The ego loves validation. It feeds on it. It tells you that your worth is contingent upon how others perceive you. It tells you that if you're not getting recognition, you're not doing it right. You're not enough. It's a subtle, almost invisible force, but it's relentless. You don't even realize you're caught in its grip until you look back and realize how much of your life you've spent seeking validation, often at the cost of your own happiness. I remember the first time I realized how deep this need ran. I had just completed a major project, something that I'd poured my heart and soul into. It was one of those career-defining moments, the kind of accomplishment people wait their whole lives for. And I thought, this is it. This is the moment where everything will feel right, where I'll finally feel validated. But after the project was finished, after the applause died down and the high faded, I was left feeling nothing. I waited for the validation. I waited for someone to come along and tell me how great I was, how amazing my work was. I waited for that "you did it" moment. But no one came, not in the way I had imagined. And I was surprised by the emptiness that followed. For all my external success, I was still hungry. Hungry for that validation that I thought would finally give me peace. That was when it hit me. My need for validation wasn't just about others recognizing my worth. It was about me not feeling worthy enough without it. The ego makes us believe that we need constant affirmation to feel whole, that our worth is tied to what others think of us. And I bought into that story for so long. I was living my life trying to prove to others and to myself that I was enough. But the story takes a sharp turn here. The more you chase validation, the more elusive it becomes. It's like chasing a shadow. It always seems just out of reach, no matter how fast you run. And the more you chase it, the more you lose sight of your own sense of self. The ego whispers, "You're nothing without this validation." And before you know it, you're living for other people's opinions instead of your own truth. Here's the thing the ego doesn't tell you. Validation from others will never be enough. You could spend your whole life looking for approval, and it will always leave you feeling hollow. Because the validation you're really craving isn't from others. It's from yourself. It's the quiet, inner knowing that you are enough, just as you are, without needing anyone else to confirm it. And that, my friends, is the real trick. The ego keeps us stuck in this endless loop of seeking approval, and it does it so well that we don't even realize we're trapped. We think, if I just get that promotion, or if I just get a little more recognition, then I'll feel fulfilled. But the truth is, no external validation will ever fill the void the ego creates. The emptiness I felt after the project, that was the ego's way of telling me, "You're not enough unless others say so." But what I needed to do, what I needed to learn, was to validate myself, to recognize my own worth, regardless of what anyone else thought. That's where the real peace lies, not in the applause of others, but in the quiet assurance that I am worthy simply because I exist. This was the hardest part of the journey. Learning to validate myself was not a one-time event. It was an ongoing practice. It meant unlearning the years of conditioning that told me my worth was tied to my achievements, my appearance, my social media following. It meant letting go of the need to prove myself and instead just being me. And it's not easy. The ego doesn't want to let go of that validation. It thrives on it. But the more I stopped chasing it, the more I started to realize something profound. I was already enough. I didn't need anyone else's approval to feel good about myself. I didn't need anyone to tell me I was doing well. I could decide that for myself. The validation I had been searching for wasn't out there. It wasn't in the accolades, the promotions, the compliments. It was in here in me. When I began to listen to that voice inside, the one that didn't need to impress anyone, the one that knew I was enough, everything changed. The funny thing is, once I stopped seeking validation, I started getting it anyway. Not because I was striving for it, but because I was finally living as myself without the weight of external expectations. People started to recognize me for who I truly was, not the version of me I had created to fit into the mold of what I thought they wanted. And the strangest thing happened. I started to feel good enough. I stopped needing constant reassurance from the outside world. I started accepting myself, flaws and all, without feeling the pressure to prove anything. Something I couldn't stop thinking about during this journey was a truth about how our minds work that studies show that people who are self-compassionate are less affected by social comparisons and external validation. They know their worth, and they don't need constant affirmation to feel good about themselves. It's a mindset shift, a shift from looking outward for approval to looking inward for self-assurance. So, if you're out there, constantly chasing validation, always trying to meet other people's expectations, I want you to hear this. You are already enough. You don't need anyone's approval to be worthy of love, success, or happiness. The ego will tell you otherwise, but you don't have to listen. You get to define your own worth. It's not easy to unlearn the need for validation. The ego is persistent. But once you realize that the approval you've been seeking was always within you, everything changes. You can stop chasing the shadow and start living fully in the light of your own truth. The cycle, I found myself trapped and was almost comical. I'd set goals, work hard to achieve them, feel that fleeting rush of success, and then immediately feel like I had to start all over again. More goals, more accomplishments, more validation. Rinse and repeat. It wasn't a life of fulfillment. It was a life of chasing. I kept running, but no matter how fast or far I went, I was never quite there. I remember a time when I finished a major project, something that had taken months of work. I'd poured everything into it. I imagined that once I crossed the finish line, I'd feel complete. It was supposed to be my reward. And for a moment, I did feel a bit of satisfaction. But then, almost immediately, the feeling disappeared, like it was never there in the first place. I waited for the recognition, for the pat on the back, the congratulations, the validation. I wanted someone to tell me I had done a good job, but nobody came. And even if they had, I realized it wouldn't have been enough. Because I was hungry for something more. I was chasing an illusion, a moving target that always seemed just out of reach. This cycle of striving, achieving, and then feeling hollow became my routine. But the more I lived in this cycle, the more I felt like something was missing. I had all the outward signs of success, good job, good friends, good life, but inside I was restless, unfulfilled. No matter how much I accomplished, it didn't fill the void. In fact, the more I achieved, the emptier I felt. The hunger grew stronger. I started to understand what the ego was doing. It was telling me that success and accomplishment were the keys to happiness. That validation from others was what would make me feel worthy. But every time I got what I thought I wanted, I was left wanting more. The ego's promise was empty. Did you know that the feeling of wanting more doesn't just come from our thoughts? There's a part of our brain called the ventral striatum, which is tied to reward and motivation. When we achieve something, that part of the brain lights up, releasing dopamine, the feel-good chemical. But the thing is, our brains are wired to want more. So even when we feel that dopamine rush, it's not about satisfaction, it's about anticipation. Our brains are constantly wired for the next thing, the next reward, and the next high. No wonder the cycle never ends. This is the trap of the ego. It convinces you that achievement will bring peace, but the peace you're looking for is always just beyond the next milestone. It makes you think that when you reach X, then you'll finally feel complete, but by the time you get there, the goalposts have moved again. The hunger never fully goes away. I started asking myself, what if I didn't need more? What if the problem wasn't that I hadn't achieved enough, but that I had built my entire sense of self-worth around chasing these external rewards? What if the success I was seeking was only reinforcing the very thing that made me feel empty? That's when I began to see the pattern. The success didn't bring happiness. The accolades didn't bring fulfillment. The more I sought approval, the more I was living for something outside of me, something that could never fill the space within me. The ego had tricked me. I wasn't living for myself. I was living for others. I was living to meet their expectations, to be seen as successful, to be admired. But in doing so, I had neglected the most important relationship in my life, the relationship with myself. So I started a shift. I stopped measuring my worth by external achievements and started measuring it by something deeper, something more lasting. I began asking myself what would truly bring me peace, not the kind of peace that comes from accolades or recognition, but the kind of peace that comes from within. It wasn't easy. The ego doesn't let go without a fight. It tells you that you need to prove your worth over and over again, that you need to achieve more to feel validated. But every time I resisted that urge, every time I didn't chase the next thing and instead focused on being rather than doing, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't a dramatic, life-altering moment. It was subtle, quiet, but it was there. I started to understand that true fulfillment comes not from doing, but from being. The ego had led me to believe that my worth was tied to what I could accomplish, but in reality, my worth was intrinsic. It was never tied to achievements or validation. It was always there within me. When I began to shift my focus away from external validation and toward internal peace, I began to experience a different kind of success, one that didn't rely on approval from others, one that didn't require constantly striving for the next big thing. And that, my friends, is when I truly began to understand what it means to be at peace with myself. I'm still on that journey. The ego doesn't just disappear overnight. It's persistent. It sneaks up on you in moments of weakness, in moments of doubt. But now I recognize it for what it is. I see it for the game it's trying to play. And instead of letting it control my actions, I choose to listen to the quieter, wiser voice inside me, the one that knows I'm enough. Without the accolades, without the approval, without the endless chase for more. And the more I listen to that voice, the more I realize this is what I've been searching for all along. The moment I started to quiet the ego, I realized something incredibly unsettling. It wasn't just that I was seeking validation from others. It was that I didn't even know who I was without the validation. My identity had been so wrapped up in what I accomplished, in how I appeared to the world, in the approval I was constantly seeking, that I forgot to ask, who am I really? It's funny, in a tragic kind of way, how we can lose ourselves in the pursuit of something we think will make us whole. The more I achieved, the more I followed the path my ego had paved for me, the further I got from the person I wanted to be. I wasn't living for me anymore. I was living for the world's approval, the world's expectations, and most importantly, for my ego's insatiable hunger for validation. The more I fed it, the more it grew, until one day, I realized I didn't recognize myself. I'd wake up every morning, go through the motions, work on the next thing, but the joy, the satisfaction, everything that should have felt fulfilling was missing. It was as if I was playing a role, not living a life. There was a disconnection, a gap between what I was doing and who I truly was. The deeper I went, the more I realized I didn't know who I was without my ego's demands. The ego tricks you into believing that without its constant pursuit, you'd be nothing, that you need to prove something, to show up in a certain way, to make everyone see you as worthy. But in the process, you forget the most important question. Who are you when you're not trying to prove yourself? This isn't just an existential crisis. It's a real shift in how you see yourself. The moment I started to confront this, I had a breakdown of sorts. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of breakdown that happens in movies, with tears and shouting. It was quieter, more unsettling. I simply realized that I had been so focused on becoming someone the world would approve of, I forgot to become myself. I had been chasing the image of who I thought I needed to be, and in doing so, I'd lost touch with the essence of who I actually was. In Eastern philosophy, particularly in Buddhism, they believe that the self we are constantly chasing is actually an illusion. The ego creates this illusion of separation, of identity, and encourages us to cling to it. But when we stop clinging and let go of the need for that validation, we come closer to understanding our true self. It's not a grand moment of realization. It's a slow, unfolding process of shedding the layers of illusion the ego has wrapped around us. I started to realize that who I thought I was, the version of me that lived for external validation, that chased approval, wasn't really who I was at all. The me I had been building was just a character I'd created, a product of societal expectations and my ego's insatiable need for recognition. But what would happen if I just stopped for a moment? What if I paused and let go of the need to be seen, to be approved of, to be praised? I started experimenting. I started doing things that weren't for anyone else. I read books for the joy of reading, not for professional development. I painted because I wanted to, not because it would make me seem creative. I took walks without checking my phone or checking it on social media. I simply was. I came to realize something important that being felt strange at first. It felt uncomfortable. The ego loves to be in motion, loves to have something to chase. But when I slowed down, when I started allowing myself to just exist, something changed. It wasn't a huge, transformative moment. It was small, like a flicker of light in a dark room, barely noticeable at first. But it was there. I felt peace in the moments where I wasn't performing for anyone. I felt whole in my simplest, most honest moments. And for the first time in a long time, I felt connected to who I really was. There's an academic debate about whether the self is truly separate or just a social construct. Some argue that our sense of self is entirely a product of society, while others believe there's something deeper at play, something inherent in us. Regardless of where you fall on that debate, I started to realize that the self I had been chasing wasn't something I needed to construct. It was always there underneath the noise, underneath the ego's layers. The challenge wasn't to become someone else. It was to strip away the versions of myself I had created and rediscover who I was beneath it all. Ego doesn't loosen its grip easily. The deeper I leaned into surrender, the more I realized how embedded it had become, controlling not just decisions but identity. It touched how I communicated, how I moved, how I shaped myself for the world. My life had become a curated image, a never-ending audition for acceptance. But here's the shift. I didn't need the spotlight. I didn't need to be convincing. I just needed to be unfiltered and proven whole. And that's when I realized something powerful. When you stop performing for others, you finally get to show up for yourself. You get to live authentically without the constant pressure of being someone else's version of who you should be. It was a slow process. I didn't wake up one day and suddenly feel free from the ego. But with each passing day, I began to feel lighter. I began to understand that I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I didn't need to be the best. I didn't need to impress. I just needed to be. The more I embraced that, the more I started to see a different version of myself. One that wasn't focused on accomplishment or approval, but on simply existing. And that, my friends, was the most freeing thing I'd ever done. The most terrifying part of this whole process wasn't confronting the ego. It was realizing how long I'd been living in its grip without even knowing it. For most of my life, I'd been living for someone else's approval, someone else's version of success. And once I understood that, I was forced to ask the hardest question of all: what now? What happens when you start to strip away everything that's been holding you together? Your identity, your achievements, your ego's narrative. It's not as simple as letting go or finding yourself. There's a space in between where the ego's grip is no longer there, but the real you hasn't fully emerged yet. It's a quiet, uncertain space where nothing feels solid. I spent a lot of time in that space. It felt like floating in limbo. Who was I without the constant need for validation? Who was I if I wasn't the successful, ambitious person everyone expected me to be? Who was I if I didn't need to prove my worth with every action, every word, every choice? At first, I felt lost. If you've ever gone through a period of deep introspection, you know that uncomfortable feeling. The feeling that you're not sure which direction to go in, not because you don't have options, but because everything you've been doing up until that point feels hollow. It's like a quiet panic that creeps in. If I'm not the person I've always been, who am I really? The ego will fight to keep you from seeing this. Feeling lost, unsure of who you are, isn't a problem to fix. It's an opening. That uncertainty, that quiet discomfort, it's your chance to begin again. Not as the version of you shaped by expectation, but as the version rooted in truth. I began to let go of the constant pressure to define myself. I stopped trying to be someone I wasn't. I stopped trying to be better or more successful than anyone else. Instead, I started asking myself different questions. What brings me joy? What am I passionate about without worrying if it aligns with society's standards? What does my life look like when I stop living for the approval of others and start living for myself? This was me, shifting behaviors once I realized I didn't need to follow the crowd, didn't need to act according to anyone else's rules. It felt uncomfortable at first, but it was also incredibly liberating. I didn't have to keep up with expectations. I didn't have to chase things that didn't serve me. I could finally start living life on my own terms, and that, my friends, was where true freedom began. Let me be clear, this process wasn't instant. It wasn't an aha moment where I suddenly felt at peace with who I was. No, it was a slow unraveling, a shedding of layers that had accumulated over years. And the further I got into it, the more I realized that the ego's grip on me wasn't just about the big moments. It was in the little things, the way I spoke, the way I reacted to situations, the way I judged myself for not being good enough. I started noticing how many times I judged myself harshly for things that didn't matter. If I made a mistake or didn't meet some expectation, I would spiral, believing I wasn't living up to some ideal of who I should be. And that ideal wasn't even mine. It was a creation of my ego, shaped by society's standards, by my desire to fit in, by my need to be seen as perfect. When you stop following the ego's demands, you start to see these things for what they are: stories. The stories we tell ourselves about who we are, who we should be, and what we need to achieve. And the most freeing realization of all is that these stories don't have to define you. In fact, the moment you stop clinging to these stories, you realize that you're not bound by them. You are free to create a new story, one that reflects who you are, not who the ego tells you to be. But here's where it gets interesting. Letting go of the ego's grip doesn't mean you stop striving for anything. It doesn't mean you give up on ambition or success. It simply means you no longer let those things define you. It means you can go after what you truly want, what resonates with you on a deeper level, without the constant pressure to prove yourself. You can succeed, but without the anxiety, the fear, or the need for approval. And what's even more incredible is that when you finally let go of the ego's expectations, you begin to attract the things you truly want, not the things you thought you needed to make you feel valid. I began to notice that when I stopped chasing approval, I started finding real connections, real fulfillment, and real joy. Not because I was perfect, but because I was finally authentic. I was no longer living for others. I was living for me. The ego doesn't want you to realize this. It wants you to keep chasing after things that won't ever truly satisfy. But once you break free from its hold, you realize that the satisfaction you've been searching for was never in external validation. It was always inside of you. So, I stopped chasing the ego's version of success. I stopped performing for others. And that's when I began to experience true freedom. The freedom to simply be. The freedom to be imperfect. The freedom to live without constantly trying to prove my worth. The freedom to just exist in the moment and trust that I am enough. And that is when I realized peace doesn't come from achievement. It doesn't come from validation. It comes from within. It comes from letting go of the ego's grip and embracing the truth that you are already whole. The more I began to untangle myself from the ego's grip, the more I started to realize how much I had been living for tomorrow. I had been spending all my time thinking about what I had to do next, what I needed to achieve, what I needed to accomplish, who I needed to impress, that I had completely forgotten how to live in the moment. The ego loves to pull us into the future, telling us that we'll be happy when we get that job, when we meet the right person, when we finally make enough money, when we achieve a certain status. It's always about the next thing. But here's the catch. When you're always living for the future, you miss the present. And the present, as it turns out, is where life happens. I hadn't realized just how much I was living in a constant state of until I started to pause and actually look at my life. I had been so focused on achieving, on succeeding, on getting there, that I forgot to ask myself the most important question. Where am I right now? What was happening right here in the present moment? When you're living for the future, you stop appreciating the things you already have. You stop seeing the beauty in the small moments, the moments that don't need any validation or recognition. You miss the joy of a quiet morning, the satisfaction of finishing a task, the peace that comes from just being. The ego tells you that these things aren't enough. They're not impressive. They don't lead to success. But in reality, it's these moments that give you the true sense of fulfillment. I started to realize how much I had taken for granted. The simple moments, the ones I had overlooked while I was chasing the next big thing, were the ones that brought me the most peace. When I sat with myself, when I stopped thinking about what I needed to do, I realized how much I had been missing. The ego made me believe that happiness was always just around the corner. But the truth is, happiness doesn't come from achieving more. It comes from living more deeply. So I began to change my approach. I stopped treating life as a checklist and started treating it as an experience. I let go of the need to constantly chase after the next achievement, the next goal, the next piece of validation. Instead, I focused on being present. on enjoying the things that mattered right now. And something extraordinary happened. For the first time in a long time, I felt enough. I felt complete, not because I had achieved some milestone or earned some external validation, but because I was alive and present. The ego wants us to think that we can only be happy when we reach the next destination. But the truth is, the only destination that really matters is the one you're in right now. Living in the moment isn't easy. The ego doesn't want you to do it. It wants you to be constantly moving, constantly achieving. But here's the secret. When you learn to be present, when you let go of the future-focused chase, everything falls into place. The work you do, the relationships you build, the simple joys you experience, they all become more meaningful because you're no longer running past them in search of something else. I started practicing mindfulness. I took a moment before I started my day to just breathe, to focus on what was happening right in front of me. I learned to enjoy the process instead of always waiting for the result. And guess what? I became more productive, more creative, more myself. When you live for the present, when you stop waiting for the next big thing, you begin to realize something incredible. You don't need to be anywhere else. You don't need to be anyone else. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. You're enough just as you are in this moment. The more I embrace this mindset, the more I notice something else, something I hadn't seen before. The world around me became richer. The conversations I had, the work I did, the people I interacted with, they all became more meaningful. Because I wasn't just going through the motions anymore. I was fully present in each moment, engaging with the world as it was, not as I imagined it should be. What surprised me most was this. The more present I became, the more deeply I connected with others. When I let go of the need to impress, when I stopped chasing validation, something shifted. My relationships became more honest, more human. I wasn't performing anymore. I was simply showing up as me. And that realness? People felt it. They responded with their own. In the end, what I learned was this. The ego will always try to tell you that you're not enough unless you're achieving something. It will convince you that your worth is tied to the next success, the next milestone, the next piece of approval. But that's a lie. The truth is, your worth has always been there in the present moment. The more you live in the present, the more you realize that you are enough exactly as you are. It's a powerful shift and one that changes everything. When you stop chasing the future and start embracing the now, you find the freedom to truly be. When I began to embrace the present, I also started to realize just how much I had been avoiding my own feelings. My ego had trained me to ignore discomfort, to push through difficult emotions, and to mask vulnerability with achievements and outward success. But the more I stopped running from the present, the more I started feeling things, real things. The good, the bad, and the messy in between. It's funny. We all talk about feeling like it's something we naturally embrace. But in reality, most of us are terrified of it. The ego, in its quest for control and perfection, convinces us that emotions are something to be avoided. It tells us that vulnerability is a weakness, that if we show our true selves, we'll be rejected. So instead of feeling, we suppress. We bury our emotions under layers of productivity, achievement, or constant distraction. But eventually, the truth comes knocking. You can only suppress things for so long before they start seeping out in strange ways, through stress, anxiety, or a sense of emptiness that no achievement seems to fill. The more I allowed myself to be present, the more I realized how much I had been avoiding, how much I had been running from. Not the big dramatic stuff, necessarily, but the small, uncomfortable feelings that are part of being human. And that was when it hit me. Feeling wasn't the enemy. The ego had made me believe that feelings were dangerous, that they would somehow derail me from my goals. But the truth was, emotions were a natural part of being alive. They didn't have to control me. They could coexist with my ambitions, my drive, my dreams. It was time for me to stop running. I needed to learn to sit with my emotions, to experience them fully instead of trying to control or hide them. But that wasn't easy. It meant facing the parts of myself that I've been ignoring for years. The fears, the insecurities, the guilt, the sadness. The ego had told me to push those feelings aside, but in doing so, I had lost connection with my authentic self. Funny thing is, the more I tried to avoid my feelings, the more they messed with me. But once I let myself feel them, really feel them, without freaking out, they lost their grip. I realized they weren't here to stay. They moved through, just like bad weather. And sitting with them, instead of running away, made me feel lighter, like I could finally breathe again. One of the most profound lessons I've learned is that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's strength. Allowing yourself to feel, to be open, to experience life fully is one of the bravest things you can do. The ego wants to protect you from vulnerability, to build walls around your heart, to make you believe that being strong means never showing your true emotions. But in reality, true strength lies in the ability to be vulnerable, to feel, to embrace your humanness. The paradox is this: the more vulnerable you allow yourself to be, the stronger you become. Living authentically, without suppressing your emotional truth, doesn't weaken you. It roots you. It grounds your presence in reality. You show up as you are, not as you think you should be. And in that brave act of honesty, you discover a strength that's unshakable because it's real. This shift wasn't instantaneous. It wasn't like one day I just decided to feel and everything magically clicked. It took practice. It took time. But every time I allowed myself to be present with my emotions, whether they were joy, sadness, anger, or fear, I felt more alive, more connected, more myself. The ego had taught me to fear emotions. But what I learned was that emotions are not enemies. They're the doorway to authenticity, to growth, to living a fully integrated life. When I finally stopped running from my feelings, something incredible happened. I stopped trying to control everything. I let go of the need to have everything figured out. I allowed myself to simply be in the moment, to let life unfold as it would. And in that surrender, I found a peace I hadn't even realized I was missing. There's an academic debate in psychology about whether or not emotions can be truly controlled. Some argue that emotions are an uncontrollable part of our biology, while others suggest that with the right tools, we can master them. My experience has shown me that it's not about controlling emotions. It's about accepting them. When you stop resisting, when you stop trying to push them away or avoid them, you gain control over how you respond to them, not necessarily how they show up. You stop being at war with yourself. And that's where the magic happens. When you stop fighting your feelings, you stop fighting yourself. You stop living to please the ego and start living to please your true self. You stop defining yourself by your achievements and start defining yourself by your being. Now, I'm not saying that I never feel uncomfortable emotions or that I've mastered emotional freedom. Far from it. But what I have learned is this: emotions don't need to be feared or avoided. They are simply visitors here to teach us something. And when we stop fighting them, we learn to flow with life instead of against it. The ego will always try to convince you that you need to be perfect, that you need to hide your vulnerabilities, that you need to control everything. But true freedom comes when you let go of that need for control, when you embrace the full spectrum of your emotions, and when you allow yourself to simply be. That's where the peace is. That's where the magic is. And that's when you realize you are enough, not because of what you accomplish, not because of the approval you get from others, but simply because you are alive, and that is more than enough. I used to think that peace was a destination. That one day, after achieving enough, doing enough, proving enough, I would finally arrive at a place where I could rest. I imagined a moment when the noise of the ego, the constant push for success, would quiet, and I could sit back and enjoy the fruits of my labor. But peace doesn't come that way. It isn't something you reach after a long struggle, and it's definitely not something that comes from external validation. I learned this the hard way. The more I pushed for success, the more I leaned into the idea that peace would come once I had enough, the more I realized peace is not a place. It's a practice. It's a practice of presence, of acceptance, and of releasing the constant need to strive. In fact, one of the biggest revelations of my journey was that the constant hustle, the nonstop striving, was actually the thing keeping me from peace. It was like I was on a treadmill running faster and faster, thinking that if I just went a little harder, I would finally get somewhere. But all I was doing was wearing myself out, going in circles. When I stopped running, when I finally stepped off the treadmill, I realized that peace had always been here. It was never somewhere else. It was in the stillness, in the moments of quiet, in the acceptance of who I was right now. Not who I could be in the future, not who I was trying to be for others, but the version of me I was in the present moment. Here's a fascinating fact. Researchers have found that people who practice mindfulness, being fully present and accepting each moment, experience lower levels of stress and greater overall well-being. It's like flipping a switch in your brain that says, you don't need to fight anymore. Just be. When I started practicing this, even in small ways, I noticed how much lighter I felt. My anxiety about the future, about what I hadn't yet achieved, started to melt away. It wasn't a one-time thing. It was a gradual unfolding of letting go of the need to control everything. The ego is driven by the belief that we must constantly chase something: success, approval, status. It convinces us that we're never enough, that there's always more to do. But peace doesn't come from doing more. It comes from being more present, more accepting, more at ease with the process of life as it unfolds. I won't lie to you, this shift wasn't easy. The ego doesn't give up without a fight. It constantly whispers, you're falling behind. You're not doing enough. Look at all the things you could be doing. But slowly, bit by bit, I began to see through its lies. I realized that I had been living in a state of constant tension, always trying to measure up to some external standard, always looking for the next thing to achieve. But none of that ever brought me lasting peace. In fact, it only left me more restless. I started to ask myself, what would happen if I stopped trying to control everything? What would happen if I just let go and trusted that everything was unfolding as it should? And that was the key: trust. Trust that, no matter what happened, I was enough. Trust that I didn't need to be perfect, that I didn't need to be constantly chasing after some future version of myself. I could simply be here in the moment and trust that the process of life was unfolding in its own time. The more I practiced this, the more I felt a deep sense of peace settling in. There's a growing conversation in the psychology community about whether we can truly achieve a sense of peace in our lives while still striving for goals. Some argue that peace and ambition are mutually exclusive, while others believe that the two can coexist if we learn to detach our sense of self-worth from our accomplishments. I lean toward the latter. I believe we can still have ambitions, pursue goals, and live purposefully, but not at the expense of our inner peace. True peace doesn't come from what we achieve, but from the way we achieve it, without fear, without the constant push to prove ourselves, without the need for validation. I began to find joy in the small things again. The way the sun feels on your face when you step outside. The laughter friends. The quiet moments when you don't have to do anything at all. Peace is in the present moment, not in the future, not in the next achievement, not in the next success. Peace is in the here and now. When you stop living for the next moment, you begin to realize that the present moment is enough. It's enough to just breathe, to exist, to be alive. And that's the hardest part for the ego to accept. It can't measure peace. It can't quantify it. But peace is the one thing that truly makes us feel whole. It doesn't come from doing more, but from doing less. The ego will tell you that you need to prove yourself, that you need to be more, do more, achieve more. But peace doesn't come from any of that. It comes from stopping. It comes from realizing that you are enough, right now, exactly as you are. And when you live from that place, you can accomplish anything you set your heart to, without the need for validation, without the anxiety of what's next. It's in those quiet moments, when you stop striving, that you realize you've been enough all along. As I continued on this journey of letting go, of untangling myself from the grip of the ego, something strange began to happen. I started to notice how much of my life I had been living on autopilot. I had been so focused on the next milestone, the next accomplishment, the next piece of validation that I forgot to actually live the life I already had. My mind was always on what was coming next. But here's the thing, life doesn't happen later. It's happening right now. And the more I let go of the ego's need to always be moving forward, the more I started to realize just how much I had been missing. The ego thrives on the future. It whispers, you'll be happy when you get that job, or everything will fall into place once you have the relationship you want, or you'll be at peace when you achieve that goal. But here's the truth. None of those things will make you happy if you're not already happy now. The future is a moving target. It's always out of reach, always changing. And the more you focus on it, the more you miss the beauty of what's happening in the present moment. I started to let go of the win-then mentality, the idea that I would be happy or fulfilled once I achieved something or once things in my life were a certain way. I began to realize that happiness isn't something that happens once you reach a destination. It's a choice you make right here, right now. It's a decision to embrace the moment, to let go of the constant need to control everything, and to accept that life, in all its unpredictability, is enough. Letting go of this constant focus on the future didn't mean I stopped pursuing goals or dreams. It didn't mean I gave up on ambition. No, it just meant I stopped letting those things define my worth. I stopped tying my happiness to external circumstances. I started living for the joy of the process, not the end result. And that's when everything changed. You see, the ego wants you to believe that you need to be someone else to be happy. It tells you that you need to be constantly improving, constantly proving yourself, and constantly striving for more. But the truth is, you're already enough. You don't need to be anyone else, and you don't need to constantly be chasing some future version of yourself. The person you are right now is worthy of love, joy, and fulfillment. The more I let go of the ego's constant push for more, the more I began to appreciate the things I had right now. I started finding joy in the simple, everyday moments, the smell of my morning coffee, the sound of laughter with friends, the quiet moments spent reading a book. The more I stopped chasing after the future, the more I realized that everything I needed was already here. It was always here, waiting for me to stop long enough to notice. It wasn't just about finding peace in the present moment. It was about finding meaning in it. And that's where the true freedom lies. The ego keeps us so focused on what's next, on what we need to do, that we forget to actually live the life we already have. It tells us that we'll find peace and happiness once we get to the next step, but the truth is, peace and happiness aren't destinations. They're ways of being. They're choices we make, right here and right now. One of the most profound realizations I had was that happiness and fulfillment don't come from getting more. They come from accepting what is. They come from choosing to be present, to appreciate what's around you, and to stop waiting for something to change in order for you to feel complete. The more I focused on what I already had, on the simple joys of life, the more I realized that the ego had been lying to me all along. I didn't need anything else to be happy. I just needed to be here in the present, fully embracing the moment. What I came to realize is the more grounded I became in the present moment, the more I saw the ego for what it really was, not a reflection of who I am, but a projection of who I thought I should be. The ego whispers that we're not enough yet, that we have to chase, prove, and constantly shape-shift into someone better. But here's the truth. It's all an illusion. There's no future version of you that's more worthy than the one sitting right here, right now. You already are who you're meant to be, and that's where the power lies. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. You don't need to chase success or validation to be worthy. You are enough right now, just as you are. The ego's job is to make you think you're not enough, to make you think you need to constantly improve, to be more, to achieve more. But once you realize that you are enough, just as you are, everything changes. So I started living for me. I stopped living for the expectations of others. I stopped letting the ego dictate my worth. And I began to embrace the present moment, to find peace in simply being. I let go of the need to prove myself, the need to impress, and the need to be constantly chasing something in the future. And in that space, I found freedom. It's not about letting go of ambition or giving up on goals. It's about letting go of the need for approval and validation. It's about accepting yourself as you are right now. And when you do that, When you stop living for the future and start living for the present, you find that you're exactly where you need to be. The ego will always tell you that you need more, that you need to prove yourself, that you need to be better. But true peace doesn't come from that. It comes from accepting that you are already enough. And that's the greatest freedom of all. When you start letting go of the ego's tight grip, something interesting happens. You begin to see how much of your life has been governed by fear. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of not being good enough, fear of the unknown, fear of not achieving enough, fear of not being seen. The ego thrives on this fear. It builds an identity around it, keeps it alive, and makes you believe that fear is necessary in order to succeed. What the ego doesn't want you to realize is simple but profound. Fear isn't truth, it's a distortion. It promises safety, but really it just locks the doors from the inside. And the more I listened to it, the more disconnected I felt from my own potential. The turning point wasn't about eliminating fear, it was about letting go of the part of me that believed I needed it. That's when I began to move freely again. I had spent so much of my life believing that fear was a sign that I was doing something wrong, that I wasn't good enough, or that I wasn't capable of handling something. The ego used fear to convince me that I had to protect myself from every possible failure, every potential mistake. But in reality, I wasn't protecting myself. I was limiting myself. Fear keeps us small. It keeps us playing it safe. It keeps us from taking risks, from stepping into the unknown, from embracing the parts of ourselves that feel uncertain or uncomfortable. The ego tells us that fear is there to protect us, but really, fear is there to control us. It keeps us from being who we are meant to be. It tells us that we need to stay within the confines of what is safe, what is acceptable, and what is expected. But what happens when we let go of that fear? What happens when we stop letting the ego dictate how we move through the world? I started to realize that the only way to truly experience freedom, to break free from the limitations the ego had set, was to move through fear, not away from it. Fear doesn't go away just because we want it to. It's going to show up. It's going to make itself known. But the trick isn't to avoid it. The trick is to lean into it, to embrace it, and to let it teach you something about yourself. One of the most powerful experiences I had in letting go of my fear was when I took a risk, a real risk, something that scared me to my core. For years, I had been holding back, playing it safe, convinced that if I didn't keep my ego protected, if I didn't keep everything neat and tidy, I would fail. But one day, I made the decision to step into the unknown. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know how it would turn out. But I knew that the fear I was feeling was the ego trying to hold me back from something greater. And you know what? It wasn't perfect. It wasn't smooth. But it was real. It was messy. It was uncertain. And it was beautiful. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive. I felt like I was truly living, not just existing. And in that moment, I realized something powerful. Fear isn't a sign to stop. It's a sign that you're about to step into something that matters. Letting go of fear didn't mean that I stopped feeling it. It didn't mean that I stopped being afraid. It meant that I stopped letting fear control my actions. It meant that I started making decisions from a place of trust, not from a place of trying to avoid failure. The ego wants you to think that avoiding fear is the key to safety. But the truth is, embracing fear is the key to growth. There's an academic debate about fear and how it functions in the human brain. Some argue that fear is an evolutionary tool, one that helps us survive by alerting us to danger. But others, like modern psychologists, suggest that while fear is important, it can be excessive. The more we feed it, the more it limits our potential. The reality is that fear doesn't just protect us, it also paralyzes us when we let it control every decision. It's important to learn to move with fear, not to hide from it. And that's what I started doing. I started moving with my fear. I acknowledged it. I felt it. And then I took action anyway. I stopped waiting for the fear to go away before I took the next step. Because the truth is, the fear never fully goes away. It's not supposed to. It's part of the human experience. But what matters is how we relate to it. Will we let it define us? Or will we let it guide us? As I continued on this journey, I realized that every time I leaned into fear, I got closer to my true self. The more I let go of the need to control every outcome, the more I trusted the process, the more I saw how much growth was waiting for me on the other side of fear. And the more I experienced this growth, the more I realized that peace wasn't about avoiding challenges. It was about embracing them with open arms, knowing that each experience would shape me in ways I couldn't predict but needed to experience. There's a quote I came across during this time that stuck with me: "Feel the fear and do it anyway." I think it perfectly sums up what I learned on this journey. Fear isn't something to run from. It's something to dance with. When you stop letting it control you, you realize that you can do so much more than you ever thought possible. And here's the truth. Every time you take action in spite of fear, you break down the walls the ego has built. You stop living in the safe little box the ego has created for you. You start living fully, authentically, and unapologetically. You step into your own power, not because you've defeated fear, but because you've learned to work with it. That, my friends, is true freedom. And it's only found when you stop letting fear control your life. When you stop allowing the ego to tell you who you can be and start listening to your own heart, your own truth. Because you've always had the power to live the life you want. It was never about the absence of fear. It was about your willingness to move through it. I'll be the first to admit that the journey towards embracing the present, shedding the ego's need for validation, and facing my fears head-on wasn't smooth. It wasn't a one-time realization that suddenly made everything perfect. No, it was a slow, sometimes painful process of unlearning. But as I moved through that discomfort, something magical happened. I started to understand how much of my life I had been living in reaction to things, reacting to others, reacting to the fear, reacting to my own insecurities. The ego thrives on this reactive nature. It loves to tell us that we need to respond to every external force, that we need to defend our status, prove our worth, and act based on what other people think of us. The moment we react, we've already given up our power. We've given the ego the control it craves. It makes us feel like we're constantly in a battle. But the truth is, life doesn't have to be a reactionary game. You don't have to live for the next stimulus. You can choose to respond from a place of awareness, from a place of intention. I started noticing how many times I would react out of habit. Someone would challenge my ideas, and I'd instantly feel the need to defend myself. Someone would criticize me, and I'd feel that familiar urge to retaliate or prove my point. But when I started to slow down, when I stopped acting out of fear or ego, I realized something profound. I didn't need to react to everything. I didn't need to prove myself to anyone. The ego tells us that reacting makes us strong, that defending ourselves is a sign of confidence. But the truth is, the most powerful thing we can do is choose when and how we respond. Not based on fear or insecurity, but based on clarity and peace. You don't have to react to every challenge. You don't have to answer every criticism. Sometimes, the greatest power comes from choosing not to engage. It's like a muscle. The more I practiced responding intentionally, the more I realized how much energy I'd been wasting on things that didn't matter. I stopped wasting time on arguments that wouldn't change anything. I stopped defending myself to people who didn't understand me. I stopped reacting to situations that only triggered my insecurities. Instead, I started living with intention, doing things because I wanted to, not because I thought I had to, responding to others from a place of calm, not reaction. This shift didn't mean I became passive or indifferent. It meant that I took control of my own narrative. I decided what mattered to me, and I stopped letting the ego dictate my responses. A strange and somewhat unrelated fact that I found interesting was the fastest way to reset your brain from a reactive state is to engage your senses. Studies show that simply touching something textured, listening to calming music, or taking a few deep breaths can interrupt the brain's automatic reactions and bring you back to the present. I started practicing this when I found myself getting triggered. Instead of reacting immediately, I would pause, take a deep breath, and focus on the present moment, on the feeling of my feet on the ground, the sound around me, the sensation of calm. It worked wonders. What I began to understand is that reacting to everything only perpetuates the ego's narrative. It keeps you stuck in a cycle of proving, defending, and protecting. But when you choose to respond with intention, you break free from that cycle. You take the power back. This was one of the most freeing parts of my journey. I started to feel like I had more control over my life. Not because I was forcing things to happen, but because I was choosing to respond to them in a way that aligned with my true self. I didn't need to react to every stimulus anymore. I didn't need to engage in every battle or challenge. I could simply be present and choose my response from a place of clarity, not fear. The more I lived from this space, the more peaceful I felt. The more I let go of the need to react to everything, the more I began to realize that the real freedom lies in choosing how to respond, not in the external forces themselves. The ego wants you to believe that you need to prove yourself, that you need to defend yourself, that you need to react to others' judgments. But in reality, true freedom comes from letting go of that need to be constantly reacting. There's a question I keep returning to. Is real freedom found in how we respond to others, or in not reacting at all? Some say freedom means letting go of how others see us. Others argue that it lies in expressing our emotions openly and authentically. For me, it's both. True freedom is choosing not to act from fear or ego, but from a grounded place of clarity. It's not suppression, and it's not impulsiveness. It's conscious presence. And that's the power we all have. Freedom is a choice. It's in the way we respond to life's challenges, to the expectations of others, and to the ego's endless need for validation. When we stop reacting out of fear and start responding from a place of self-awareness, we reclaim our power. I started to realize that every time I chose not to react, I was taking back a piece of my power. I was no longer letting the external world dictate how I felt or how I responded. I was choosing to live in a way that aligned with my true self, not with the story the ego had created for me. This is where the magic happens. When you stop reacting to everything, when you let go of the ego's constant push for validation and approval, you begin to experience life differently. You start living from a place of peace, of inner knowing. You begin to realize that you don't need to prove anything. You don't need to defend yourself. You just need to be. And that's when I found the freedom I had been searching for. Not in the external world, not in the accolades, the achievements, or the validation, but in the quiet power of choosing how I respond, choosing how I show up, and choosing to live for myself. The ego can try to control you, but when you stop reacting to it, when you let go of the need for approval, you realize that you are free. Free to live your truth, free to be your authentic self, and free to move through the world without fear. And that, my friends, is the ultimate freedom. I had always imagined that finding peace meant conquering the world. I thought it meant reaching the highest peak of success and claiming victory after victory, watching as the world celebrated my achievements. But what I discovered, after years of chasing that elusive promise, is that true peace comes from a very different place. It comes from within. It's not about accumulating things or titles. It's not about proving your worth through external measures. It's about understanding that you are already complete, already whole, and that peace is something you create within yourself. When you realize that the real battle was never outside of you, it was always within, you begin to see that the ego, the part of you that was driving you to be better, was never working for your true good. It was working to keep you distracted from what you already had, a deep, unshakable peace. I don't want to pretend that the journey was easy. It wasn't. Every day is a practice. Every moment is a choice to embrace the present, to stop listening to the ego, and to trust that peace is not something to be earned, but something to be accepted. It's a lesson that never really stops unfolding. The ego will always try to sneak in, telling you that you're not enough, that you need to do more, be more, chase more. But the more I sit with the reality that I am enough just as I am, the less power the ego holds over me. I don't need to be someone else, and I don't need to chase some idealized version of success. I'm already complete. I am enough. There's an incredible freedom in this realization. When you stop needing to prove yourself, When you stop measuring your worth by external standards, you begin to experience life in a whole new way. You can start to savor the moments, the simple, beautiful moments that the ego once overlooked in its mad dash for more. You can start to see people for who they truly are, not as competitors or mirrors of your success, but as fellow human beings walking their own journey. And you can start to understand that, despite our differences, we are all connected by our shared humanity. The ego wants to keep us isolated, separate, constantly comparing ourselves to others. But when you let go of that separation, you realize that you are never alone. True peace is about accepting who you are right now, without the need for validation, without the need for success, without the need for comparison. It's about stepping out of the race, slowing down, and understanding that your worth is not tied to what you do, but simply in your being. I learned that peace doesn't come from doing. It comes from being. It comes from embracing the present moment, from accepting your emotions, your flaws, your imperfection, and knowing that none of it makes you any less worthy of love, success, or happiness. As I reflect on the journey that led me here, I can't help but be grateful for the moments of struggle, the moments when I was so lost, so caught in the ego's web that I didn't know which way was up. Because those moments were the ones that allowed me to break free. There were the moments when I finally realized that I didn't need to keep chasing approval. I didn't need to prove anything. I just needed to trust the process, trust myself, and trust that everything would unfold as it should. And now, in the stillness, I feel the peace that I once thought I needed to earn. It's here. It's always been here. It's in the simple, quiet moments of being present with myself, with the world, and with others. It's in letting go of the need for perfection, of the need to be anything other than what I am. So, I'll leave you with this thought. You don't need to be better. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to chase success or approval. You are enough, right now, just as you are. And when you realize that, when you stop letting the ego drive your life, you'll find that peace was never somewhere else, somewhere in the future. It was always here, waiting for you to notice. You've always been enough. And that, my friends, is the ultimate freedom.